Thank you all for coming out for this really important talk by my friend and colleague, Colin Gordon. So my job here is basically just to tell you all who Professor Gordon is. I thought it would be funny when I Googled his latest accomplishments to read the Wikipedia for the long deceased British actor by the same name. But I didn't think you'd appreciate having died in 1971. So Professor Colin Gordon is a professor of history and the chair of the history department at the University of Iowa. Do not hold that against him. He is a proud PhD alum of the University of Wisconsin. Professor Gordon is one of the most recognized historians in the nation when it comes to issues of housing inequality in particular, and urban inequality more generally. He is the author most recently of the book Patchwork Apartheid, Private Restriction, Racial Segregation, and Urban Inequality, which came out last year. It's a really, really important and interesting book, but that follows on the heels of a long record of publishing, including Citizen Brown, Race, Democracy, and Inequality in the St. Louis Suburbs, which came out in 2019, Mapping Decline, St. Louis and the Fate of the American City, which came out in 2008, Dead on Arrival, The Politics of Health in 20th Century America, which came out in 2003, and last but not least, New Deals, Business, Labor, and Politics, 1920 to 1935. Professor Gordon has also published widely in popular publications, The Nation, Dissent, Jacobin, etc. And he's also really involved in a variety of different public-facing scholarship, digital projects to go along with things like Patchwork Apartheid, to go along with things like Citizen Brown, and so on and so forth. Recent research by Professor Gordon has been supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities, a visiting scholar fellowship at the Russell Sage Foundation, and with our shared homie, deep friend, Ashley Howard. He is the winner of a major Mellon Foundation higher learning grant, doing really important work, looking at the ways in which housing inequality has sort of been baked into the DNA of the marketplace in a variety of ways in the United States. I could keep going, but you are not here to listen to me talk. So without further ado, I will turn things over. Please welcome Dr. Colin Gordon.
Thanks, Simon. And thanks for having me back. It's a pleasure to come back. I did get my degree here 34 years ago today. Place hasn't changed much. I was thinking one time I was here and Eric Wright was hosting a seminar and with a feminist scholar. And what I remember was Eric was trying to explain to the room at what angle gender intersected with class. 17 degrees. I kid you not. So I'm going to talk today about my book, Patchwork Apartheid, which was a result of a couple of years of work in local property records in a variety of Midwestern settings. And it's about the use and the implications and the sort of long-term impact of the use of private restrictions on property. And I want to take a moment to just explain sort of what these were and how they worked, because this was a peculiar form of controlling the occupancy and use of land. And they're important because they preceded conventional zoning, which wasn't constitutionally sort of blessed in this country until 1926. They also preceded conventional or modern day building codes. And so you can think of them as a sort of mashup of a building code, a zoning ordinance, and an HOA set of rules in a document that is a private contract, either between a buyer and a seller, or a single buyer and a seller, or between a developer and all of the purchasers of that property. And so it was a way of controlling the use of land before we had local public policies, which said you can't build a gas station on that corner, that sort of thing. And they were almost always about setting restrictions on what you could do with the land. And these restrictions ran the gamut. A lot of it was the prevention of nuisances. So you can't boil horses in your backyard to make glue. You can't have a slaughterhouse. You can't have a junkyard. There's often long lists of these kinds of uses. They were often sort of, particularly suburban ones, where these developments were going out into the cornfields in the Midwest. They were in sort of rural areas. They were intended to say, this is an urban area. You can't have chickens. You can't have a cow. You can't have a horse. You can't have more than 2 dogs. Your radio antenna can't stick up this far, that sort of thing. All these kinds of restrictions. But at their peak in the 1920s and 1930s, the most ubiquitous form of restriction was racial. That regardless of all the other restrictions that were put on the property, there was almost always a sort of Caucasians only, no color, no Negro, and the Midwest, it's usually that simple attached to it. So in the book, I try and do a number of things. First of all, it's largely a sort of, or at first blush, a documentary exercise. It takes a lot of work, as I'll explain, just to find these, to document them, and to document them, not just the fact of their existence, but for precisely where they were, when they were put in place, and to sort of map them in such a way that you can connect them to patterns of segregation at the time and later. I also, and in doing that, I think one of the contributions of the book is it gives us a much better sense of just how ubiquitous these were, of how common they were. Particularly in new subdivision development, it was just the business practice. And so, it's not as if there's this sort of scattered attempt to draw the color line in an urban neighborhood. But, as the NAACP recognized at the time, this was the way cities were organized by race in fundamental ways. It also enables us, I think, to think of racial segregation of the American city, not just as a distributional outcome, not as just something you can say, well, these people live here and these people live here, but as a process. How does it actually happen? How are those lines drawn? How are people moved around, prevented from living in one place, encouraged to live in another? And I'm very interested in segregation as a process. Also importantly, I think it turns our attention away, or not away from, but it tips the balance back towards private actors. A lot of the scholarship in this space is taken up by people who look at what the federal government did in the 1930s and 1940s. This is, undeniably important because, it's the federal government. They have the Bill of Rights in their back pocket. We expect them not to sort of bless this kind of practice. But I think books like Richard Rothstein's Color of Law are misleading in the sense that they think that's the source of segregation, because it's not. That, as I'll show, that segregation was almost completely accomplished with private mechanisms prior to federal law. And then finally, when I close the talk, I want to think about what this means in the long term, because the practice of private restriction was constrained in 1948. The Supreme Court said, you can write these contracts, but public bodies can't enforce them as a sort of equal protection. And it was not until 1968, under the Fair Housing Act, that they were illegal on their face to even enter into. But, they're durable in a lot of ways, not the least of which is that they still sit there in the property records, because county recorders and assessors who maintain property records, rule number one is you never remove a piece of paper. You just put another one on top. And so people are always finding these. There's a story in the newspaper every year of someone who was like, holy crap, what is this, right, in my deed record. So first of all, I want to talk a little bit about collecting the data, because this is one of the biggest obstacles to doing this kind of work, but those obstacles are coming down. So most of what you find when you go into a county recorder's office looks like this. These are deed books. They're sort of large format, much of it handwritten. And the county recorders collect documents quite literally in the order that people walk in the door. So in a given deed book, which are always 640 pages, because it's a standard sort of product for local governments. So you will have, someone will rent their corn crib, someone will have a draft deferral, someone will have an adoption or an annulment, and then there'll be someone moves their driveway 6 inches, and then there's a sale with a racial restriction on it, and then you're back to this other stuff. So they're very difficult to find, and the only index for these records is buyer and seller, grantor and grantee. And that doesn't tell you if there's a racial restriction. So how do we find them? Well, in part, the obstacle to documenting these has come down a little bit, because every county recorder's office in the country has been engaged, over the past 10 or 20 years in furiously digitizing their records so that they can deliver them in online databases to realtors, developers, and others. They don't want the sort of storefront, come in, I'll write your name down kind of service. And so the private vendors who are digitizing these then give the images to the county. And in some cases, you can get a memorandum of understanding with the county, and you can get the raw files. And if they're not handwritten, as unfortunately some of them are, you can then read them using optical character recognition, and they become searchable by other means. So I did this in a string of counties that are strung along what is colloquially called the Avenue of the Saints, from St. Louis in the south to Minneapolis in the north. So Hennepin County in Minneapolis. This was done by the Mapping Prejudice Project, colleagues of mine in Minneapolis. Hennepin County is a very well-resourced county. All of their records going back to 1914 are digitized, and they're all typewritten. So once they had an agreement with the county to get them, they could just sort of roll through them and find all the racial restrictions. I did work on Blackhawk County with students. This is not a large county in Iowa, but it has a large urban center, Waterloo, Iowa, with a significant African-American population. When the first racial restrictions were done in 1914, they didn't know what to do with them. So they didn't put them in the deed books. They put them in their miscellaneous records, which is a much smaller collection, and indexed them. So we could find them quite easily. Blackhawk County is an interesting example because while it's a small Iowa industrial setting, there was a shopman strike in 1912, and the Illinois Central brought up African-American strikebreakers from Mississippi. And so Blackhawk, in a sense, had a precocious first Great Migration population. It's very unusual for that part of the country. Then we also did Johnson County, largely because that's where the University of Iowa is. And here again, we were able to get original deed images and subdivision records. St. Louis County, which is the suburban county west of the city of St. Louis. This was a difficult one because the St. Louis County deed records are handwritten into the 1960s. So even if I, as a developer, came into the St. Louis County Recorder's office in 1958 and said, here's a 20-page typescript of the restrictions on my subdivision, someone at the deeds office, like a monk, would handwrite that into a deed book. And that's what their records look like. But they kept a record of every restriction because they wanted to know when someone came in, oh, are you allowed to build a gas station on that corner? Or are you allowed to do this? So they have a card index to the restricted subdivisions. And so we could go back and forth between the deed records and the subdivisions. The other thing I was telling my friend Laura earlier, these are records that were only viewable on microfilm. It's white on black, and they're photocopied like this. So every page you have the whole thing. So you can sort of get motion sickness doing the research. I spent the pandemic. And then the city of St. Louis, which is a very under-resourced, the records are a mess. And here we didn't know how we were going to get into the records because they're not digitized and not searchable until we found that in City Hall is one of these private title companies whose job it is to assemble the abstract when there's a transaction. And they were like, screw it, the city is not doing anything to organize these records, so we will. So they privately kept an index that we discovered in the course of our research. And so we were able, again, to go in surgically and identify all the restrictions. So when we do that, we built a basic database collecting this information. We want to know where they came from, when they were restricted, what kind of a restriction was, which I'll talk a bit about in a moment. how big the lots was, because it's, it's interesting. Is this a small lot, working class suburb, or is it some, horsey bridal thing way out in the suburbs? The terms of restriction are important. How long do they last? What are the penalties for violating it? And something I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A, the language of the restriction is very interesting, because the early ones are all these sort of eugenics catalogs where it's like a long list of like no Romanians, no Bulgarians, no Jews, no colored, and they just go on and on. But by the 1930s, it's just they just say Caucasian. And the flip is it has some important implications. And then we also wanted to draw out of each of these some sort of geospatial data that would enable us to map them. Now, here we were fortunate that in the Midwest, property is organized on a grid system all the way down: state, county, township, city block, and the original description, Happy Acres Lot 6, is never erased from the record. So even if it's redeveloped as a shopping mall, I can tell in the current property record that that was Happy Acres Lot 6. So what we did was we used a combination of the current record, which gave us about a 70% match parcel to parcel. And then the other 30% we had to recreate from the original subdivision plat maps. Those are ones that have been redeveloped as, shopping malls or gravel pits or, parts of the university or whatever. So what we found across these settings was a number of different patterns. First of all, I think what's interesting is, despite the fact that the African-American population of these settings varied quite a bit, St. Louis is a border city, very much a first-grade migration city whose African-American population is well established by 1920. Hennepin County has a much smaller African-American population and a negligible one in the first-grade migration. Its African-American population is largely comes in the 1960s and 1970s. Blackhawk County, again, that initial African-American migration. And, I throw in Johnson County here because it has a tiny African-American population, but yet the practice of restriction was pretty common, simply because, as I suggested at the outset, it's a business practice. It's what all the realtors and developers are doing. It's just part of doing business. So it's not necessarily a response to racial threat in that kind of a setting. What we also find is that particularly in if we look at Hennepin County and the total, that most of these were suburban. So outside the city of St. Louis, outside the city of Minneapolis, they are much more common. The ones that take place inside urban settings have a different logic and a different pattern that I'll get to in a minute. There are three principal kinds of restriction. One is what I call a sort of parcel restriction, is simply, I'm selling my property to you, and I say to you as a condition of that sale that you cannot do this with the property, including things you cannot do with it. You can't have a garage with a wooden roof. You can't boil a horse in your backyard to make glue, but also restrictions on alienation. You can't sell to an African American. But that's just a private contract between the grantor and the grantee. And here's the sort of language. The land or building there should never be rented, leased, or sold, transferred, or conveyed to, nor shall the same be occupied exclusively by any Negro or colored person or person of Negro blood. This was a complicated legal question, because in some states, first of all, if you think about it, private agreements to restrict the alienation of property is not a very American thing to do, like voluntarily entering into restrictions on what you can do with your property, which suggests the sort of gravity of this kind of agreement. And in some states, you could restrict sale but not occupancy, and it depended a lot on the sort of vagaries of state law. In terms of scale, the vast majority of these are based on a subdivision. That is, they're not something between buyer and seller, but they're established by the original developer. And the ones that are established by the original developer are on much firmer sort of legal ground, because there's a doctrine in American property law called the Sanborn Doctrine, which holds that if an original grantor, somebody that owns, this entire tract of land, places a restriction, it's understood to apply to every subdivided lot on that restriction, even if it's not specifically in the documentation for that lot. So they look like this. So this is a subdivision plat. It's showing the drawing of these lots, in this case, Moritz Place in St. Louis County. And then in St. Louis County and Waterloo and a couple other places, the restrictions are just written on the margins of the map. So here it is. You can see following restrictions for a term of 50 years, no dairy, so here are the nuisances: no dairy, assignation house, slaughterhouse, glue factory, soap factory, etc. That would constitute a nuisance. But then continuing, what are other nuisances? Well, African American occupancy would be a nuisance. And so no building or lot to be rented or leased to Negroes. And also often you see these restrictions on, you have to have houses of a certain value. And then the final important form, which we find only in some settings, is a petition. And this is a large scale agreement, like a subdivision lot, like not just one grantor and one grantee, but it's done in a well-established neighborhood, and almost always in response to a palpable threat of, Negro invasion, as was put at the time. These were particularly common in the city of St. Louis and in the city of Chicago, cities that had these first Great Migration populations, where the realtors were very involved in going door to door, getting people to sign up to these agreements, creating sort of AstroTurf neighborhood organizations, collecting signatures, and that sort of thing. These were much more legally tenuous. And in fact, all of the litigation surrounding racially restricted covenants is about petitions. Shelley versus Kramer was a petition, because the only legal line of attack that the NAACP and others had before 1948 was that the contract was badly drawn. Not enough people signed it. People signed for each other. And this was the conditions under which these were found illegal or unenforceable in almost every legal case through the Shelley versus Kramer case in 1940. So in these patterns, we see, they fall into different sort of regional patterns or local metropolitan patterns. As I suggested, most of these, in terms of the number of agreements and in terms of the number of parcels, are subdivision restrictions, those ones put on by original developers. Particularly, as you can see, in Hennepin County and St. Louis County, those big metro suburban settings. The petition restrictions are these artifacts of the first Great Migration. So I only see these in my data in the city of St. Louis. I'll show you that in more detail in a minute. And in Blackhawk County, in response to that initial infusion of African American occupancy when they break the shopman strike in 1914. So these have very different sort of implications on the ground and very different long-term trajectories. So in terms of timing, these were, the vast majority of restrictions are put in place between about 1915 and 1950. And so they disappear almost completely after Shelley versus Kramer. They're just not worth the effort because they're unenforceable. And so a lot of the ones that are still there afterwards are just sort of inertia. The developer keeps doing the same thing. But as you see, so this is for the city of St. Louis, or county of St. Louis. These are subdivision restrictions. There's just a single petition. You can see that little red dot there. And it closely tracks housing starts. So because this is on new development, unsurprisingly, it peaks with the housing boom in the 1920s, collapses during the Great Depression when no one's building houses, peaks again with the boom in World War I, and is on the way up until Shelley versus Kramer, and then it drops off. So these are housing starts, and Shelley versus Kramer is here, and the practice drops off. In Hennepin County, we see much the same thing. This peaked during the housing boom of the 1920s, again, with the second Great Migration in the 1940s, but dropping off pretty quickly with the Kramer decision. The city of St. Louis is a more interesting case because it's a much wider variety of types of restrictions. The red ones are restrictions by petition, which in terms of the number of restricted parcels far outnumber subdivisions. And what we have here in this pattern is not just this peak of restricted ones in the 1920s, but most of these restrictions that were drawn in the 1920s had a sunset clause of roughly 20 years. So there's all these renewals in the 1940s. They go back to the same neighborhoods. And they say, you got to sign this thing again. But otherwise, the same thing, sort of tracking housing starts over this time. Blackhawk County has a sort of more interesting bimodal distribution. You get this flurry in response to the arrival of first African-American migrants. But other than that, it's all a response to the Second Great Migration. There's virtually no restrictive activity in the housing boom of the 1920s. So what that looks like in these particular settings, and I'll just let these play out. So this is the city of St. Louis and St. Louis County, which is going forward in time. So you can see the suburban restrictions in the county, and then all these petition restrictions in the city, basically forming this ragged donut around the African-American community. So that's that metropolitan area. We'll come back to versions of this map later. This is Hennepin County, which is quite a different pattern. No petition restrictions at all. And they're almost all suburban restrictions in the absence of any real African-American population, even in the city of Minneapolis itself. And so, you know, this is Richfield, the airport's down here, but mostly western suburbs of Minneapolis. So these are much more sort of aspirational, again, not in response to any sort of palpable. In Blackhawk County, where Waterloo is, you get this big petition restriction in response to the first influx of African Americans. And then again, very little action in the 1920s and 1930s. And then during the Second Great Migration, all of these subdivisions, which are restricted. So turning to the sort of on the ground implications, what this means for the segregation of these cities. What we see, and I want to come back to the point I made at the outset about the timing of segregation. In every one of these settings, racial segregation, and here I'm using the dissimilarity index of segregation and using enumeration districts, which are a very small sort of unit. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, the dissimilarity index basically imagines, so imagine it's like a 10 by 10 grid, population evenly distributed, or unevenly distributed, say all the African Americans live in one corner. So the dissimilarity index says how much of the population would you have to redistribute so that the population of the whole, population of each small unit is the same as the population as a whole in terms of the distribution, right? And so the higher number, the more segregation you have. And for urban racial segregation, a number of above 0.55 is considered higher. And these are very high levels, going up to into the 80s for greater St. Louis. But all of the increase in segregation occurs during this era of private restriction. Even though the federal programs come online in the 1930s, they have very little impact because no one is building houses again until 1946, 1947, at which point the segregation is completely accomplished. We see roughly the same pattern in Minneapolis, where all of the increase in segregation occurs again before 1950. And the effect of the federal policies is in a sense to freeze that into place, to not challenge it for a number of years, but not to create it. Now, as I said at the outset, it's important to recognize this, not just the distributional outcome, not just how much segregation do we get, but what does it look like on the ground? So if we zoom in on North St. Louis, this, never showing this thing, do they? This area here is called the Ville, which is the sort of historic area of African-American occupancy. The first African-American high school west of Mississippi is in the Ville. It's well established by 1910, 1915. But the rest of North St. Louis is basically sort of white working class housing. And so much of the effort of racial restriction is meant to contain the Ville. And so again, if we sort of go through this pattern, and this showing different types of restriction, but you can see the dramatic use of these petition restrictions around the Ville in order to contain it. But it was an interesting sort of process because, and this again, so inside the green squares, the Ville, this, which will come into, is important later, is Delmar Boulevard, which locally is called the Delmar Divide. And this is what that looks like in 1920. And so this is the Shelley versus Kramer restriction. This is one of the very first. By 1922, you can see, so those three exist in 1920, those three, and each of those is a distinct restriction. That's the deed book number that's attached to them, right? And so these petition restrictions were fairly small scale. What happened was, what was generally a realtor would go into a neighborhood and say, look, the colored are coming. If all your neighbors are signing, and if you sign, the neighborhood would be protected. They would go door to door getting signatures. But white homeowners were like a little bit leery about alienating their property rights. And, some of them were like, well, they're already here. And I think I'm going to go to the suburbs. I'm not going to sign. And so as soon as the signatures petered out, they would say, well, that's the end of that one. They'd file it at the recorder's office at City Hall. They'd walk 2 blocks over and start again. So these are only like 20 to 40 properties apiece. And in the end, in this circle that I'm going to show you, there's over 500 of these agreements. And so that's the situation in 1922. So the pink ones are ones that are 20 or 21 or earlier. These are the new ones in 1922. So you can see they're sort of bouncing around on the outskirts of the bill saying, we're going to contain this neighborhood. But it's complicated by the fact that African-Americans had settled in this neighborhood known as the Finney Cook neighborhood. And the realtors didn't really know what to do about it. This neighborhood had a number of restrictions on them, but they'd failed. And the realtors and some homeowners were sort of torn between, admitting that they'd lost, the neighborhood had tipped, and just sort of retreating, which seems sort of sensible in one respect. But they were also loath to give up on, to say that a restrictive covenant had failed or restrictive agreement had failed, even if, the block was now entirely occupied by African Americans. So as you can see, they start to draw restrictions between the two, but also, sort of strategically retreating to Del Mar and saying, well, let's solidify this southern border. And they keep drawing them around the border. And then finally, in the 1930s, they give up and they say, look, we just got to fortify Del Mar. And they actually drop down a block south of Del Mar because, and this is another sort of interesting aspect of this, they're cooperating with the city this whole time. And the city planners they're coordinating with city planners on this. And so the reason they drop down from Del Mar is they persuade the city to widen Del Mar, run a streetcar down it, and rezone both sides commercial, make it a hard physical boundary. And then it's like, so we're not restricting on Del Mar anymore because it's all grocery stores, and dress shops. We'll go to the private street just south and solidify the line. And so this creates what, again, is still in St. Louis today called the Del Mar Divide. North of this line, the population is over 90% African American. South of this line, it's less than 18% African American. Still, a starkly segregated settings. I'll show you. Waterloo as an interesting example. So this is the rail bed in the center of Waterloo. And when the strikebreakers come in, they're put up in rail cars along the rail bed for the short term, but they gradually look for rooms in the neighborhood. So this charts every house in which an African-American lived in 1920 and the big petition restriction that is put in place. Over 600 homeowners signed. But it's fragile. As you can see, African-American occupancy is sprinkled in here, even in areas where it's signed. And so people who had originally signed sometimes want to get out from under. In fact, both in Waterloo and in the city of St. Louis, most of the legal challenges in the 1930s were brought by white homeowners who wanted out from something that their parents had signed. They wanted essentially to defect from the agreement. And so you can see it becomes more and more complicated in Waterloo. And then you start to get these sort of backup restrictions. Well, this one is clearly broken down. So here's a hard physical boundary. We do a petition on this neighborhood, we should be good. And that's the sort of pattern it takes. Leveraging, not just the restrictive covenants, but cooperation with city officials, which is about widening streets, about running public transit. It's about local zoning. It's about where school catchment areas are. Because, one thing that happens if you say, well, we're going to run a streetcar down this street, widen it and make it commercial. Well, all of a sudden, this is one elementary school, and this is another. And that sort of hardens the division between the neighborhoods. And so this is what Waterloo looks like today. And so this area by the tracks, which is known as the Triangle in Waterloo, is still predominantly the area of African-American occupancy. And you can see the footprint of these older restricted covenants are still, less than 10% African-Americans. So it's still a very starkly segregated city, the most segregated city in Iowa. Hennepin County still does not have a large African-American population, but much of it is in this northwest corner of the city. These, I would argue, don't have much of an impact, except in the sense that they sort of sort people on arrival during the Second Great Migration, that these become well-established white-only neighborhoods. And whether the restrictions themselves or the practices that follow to sort of channel African-American occupancy. Again, this is 2020 African-American occupancy into certain neighborhoods in the city. And this is St. Louis. St. Louis is a more complicated case. So, again, this is the Delmar Divide. See very stark in terms of African-American occupancy, but you also see very uneven sort of long-term effectiveness of race restrictions. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is the moment Shelley versus Kramer was decided, white flight from the north side just took off. And so no one intended to sit in these sort of embattled transitional neighborhoods if the petitions were unenforceable. Gave up. This area, and so, just to give you a reference point, Ferguson is here, where Michael Brown was shot. So these are the inner suburbs between the city and the airport. And most of these restrictions were drawn before 1925, and they're on very small lots. They're not on what we would today conventionally consider suburbs, right? These are 4,000 or 5,000 square foot lots, which is about half the size of what you get in Central and South County. And so, these are both exclusively zoned and racially restricted, but these prove, in the long term, not to be particularly effective at stemming racial transition, most of which comes after the covenants themselves are rendered unenforced by the Shelley decision. So this yields a couple of outcomes, I think, that are interesting. One is, particularly in these settings, you get a really stark gap, sort of exclusionary gap in home ownership, where the white ownership rate is far higher than the black ownership rate. But even where those are closer together, like in St. Louis and St. Louis County, you get a sort of exploitation gap where African-American housing values are dramatically less than those of white housing values. Because what also happens in North St. Louis in the wake of Shelley versus Kramer is that housing values go through the floor. And so that, African-Americans were able to get into the housing market because of the Kramer decision and because of the collapsing values, but they didn't turn out to be very effective long-term investments. And then I'll just close by suggesting, how do we make sense of what happens between 1948 and today? Like, how do these, not in letter, but in spirit and effect, continue to shape these settings? And I use here, the language of sociology of inequality, working from Charles Tilley's work, but also Elizabeth Anderson's really wonderful book, The Imperative of Integration. And so, one thing that happens is you have a practice like a race-restricted covenant, and it's declared unenforceable, but that doesn't prevent other actors from emulating and picking up on its logic. So what you find, for example, is that property appraisers use this all the time, and they continue to use it as a guide to what the value of a piece of property is. And so, in this famous book by Homer Hoyt, he acknowledges this is entirely due to racial prejudice, but it's real because people act on a figment of their own actions, and so it does have an effect on the value of property. and it gets baked into property appraisals. We hear horror stories every year of, middle-class African Americans having their property appraised and having some lowball appraisal. But if they put the picture down on the mantle, everything changes. There's also patterns of, what you could term in this language of sociology of inequality, adaptation. That all the local actors, including African American residents and homeowners, have to adapt to these circumstances. One of those adaptations is dense crowding in the years of the Great Migration in those few neighborhoods where African Americans could live or buy houses. And that, of course, yields what? It yields tremendous stress on the housing stock, a sense that that African American occupancy is even further destructive housing stock, and the conviction, once we get into the post-World War II period, that these neighborhoods need to be blighted and wiped out and have baseball stadiums built where they once stood. Alongside, sort of akin to emulation is what we call leverage. That is, it's distinct from emulation because leverage is where you're using some sort of private market power to extend this practice. And this is particularly important, I think, in the case of private realty and also appraisal, as I said. That if you have market actors or institutions like the Real Estate Board of Greater St. Louis or the Real Estate Board of Chicago that accept this as going practice and say, we're going to continue to respect the lines of these covenants, even though the Supreme Court says we can't enforce them, then you are sustaining that in ways that Shelley versus Kramer can do nothing about. And so the realtors actually write it into their code of ethics. And this long outlasts Shelley versus Kramer, the idea that a realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character of property or occupancy, members of any race or nationality that would be detrimental to property values. Again, leveraging this notion that African American occupancy is a nuisance, destructive of property values, allows it to last so much longer. Because it can also, in the hands of realtors and appraisals, become, in their view, almost a sort of neutral assessment. I'm not responsible for this, but if people think that African American neighborhoods, the houses are worth less, then that's true, and I'm going to act accordingly. A subset of leverage, which is important, is what I would characterize as institutionalization. This is when you're using not market power, but political power to say the same thing. And here the Homeowners Loan Corporation maps become important, but particularly the FHA. If you read the narrative descriptions of the homeowners maps, they're full of references to restrictions, whether restrictions are expiring, in valuing neighborhoods for mortgage lending. The HOLC maps themselves don't have a tremendous impact. They're not widely circulated, and they're not really widely used before the HOLC is taken over by the Federal Housing Administration. So we basically use those sort of colored redlining maps as a proxy for what the FHA is probably doing, because they have the same set of maps, but they burned them all in the 1960s. This institutionalization can be done by in this sort of federal lending, the way in which mortgages are subsidized or not subsidized, but also with local zoning and planning. And so, these are the restrictions in St. Louis, which are in black on this map. And you can see they correspond to the way in which property is zoned. In fact, much of North St. Louis during this period is upzoned to from single family to multifamily in order to accommodate African American migrants with such limited housing opportunities. And you see it, as I suggested already, in planning. So Del Mar is not only zoned commercial, but well after the fact, in the 1960s and 1970s, planning decisions are made to basically seal off North St. Louis from South St. Louis through traffic calming measures. And so all of these streets that used to be a pure grid have either turned into these cul-de-sacs, or they have what are in St. Louis called schmoll pots, after the mayor in the 1980s who loved to use these to barricade neighborhoods. So if you're driving along Del Mar Boulevard, this major arterial, you cannot turn south into the city of St. Louis until you get to the border. And then again, as I mentioned, these are baked into the rating of neighborhoods by the Homeowners Loan Corporation and the Federal Housing Administration, which again are most important for the FHA because it's the one that's financing new construction in suburbs, particularly after World War II. And then finally, I just say a couple of things to note. When we're talking about how inequalities become durable, Tilley's book, Durable Inequality, is largely about sort of occupational settings and about how those inequalities last. Housing is a special case because you're actually physically building something. So there's a tremendous amount of inertia from putting this in the built environment, from doing your land planning accordingly in order to sustain that, from leveraging physical assets like railroads and that sort of thing. And from the sort of long-term implications for Black and white homeowners, you create this immense racial gap, home equity gap. And so you can't just, say in 1948 or 1968, oh, don't do that anymore. It's not like the people who have been affected can say, oh, I'll go buy a house now, because it's not possible. And then, again, overlaying all of this is a sort of pattern of rationalization, of stereotyping, of way in which we talk about neighborhoods, about good neighborhoods and bad neighborhoods, which create what one group of sociologists call these sort of cycles of segregation that are self-reinforcing, and that are understood and acted upon by people who are looking for homes, who are looking for a place to rent, by people who are realtors who are helping people look for places. We know that the realty industry and the appraisal industry still acts on these core assumptions that were created during the era of private restriction. Sort of schematic of that, and I'll leave it there.
So is there, I'm thinking about the long-term monetary impacts of this from a wealth perspective. And I mean, you're doing so much amazing work with quantifying things, but I'm thinking about, before your talk, we were discussing briefly like how all of this builds a reparations case and things like that. And so I was, as you were talking, I was thinking about, Ta-Nehisi Coates' famous article in The Atlantic, The Case for Reparations, that's about how segregation and housing inequality, can create such a case, right? And thinking about Beryl Satter's work in Chicago, where her dad was a lawyer, for those of you who don't know, who worked on housing inequality cases. He estimated that in the city of Chicago, Black communities were being robbed of $1 million every day in the 1950s because of predatory, not precisely this, but predatory housing mechanisms that rhymed with these types of things. So I'm just wondering, Colin, if you have such a sense of like how much this has contributed to wealth imbalances and the broader wealth gap, and if you have thought yourself about how this might turn into a case for reparations.
Yeah, it's a good question. And then there's also, I want to give a shout out to Andrew Carl's new book, The Black Tax, which is about what he calls the sort of short end of both sticks, which is both the appraisal and the assessor, sort of high taxes and low property appraisals. So, which, leads me into my answer, which is very hard to unpack, which elements of this, where the value is lost. I think so there are two reasons why I think people rely on the Hulk maps so much. One is a sort of drunk under the streetlight research strategy, which is like, we don't have evidence of what happened, but if there's a light shining here, so I'll look for my keys here, right? Yeah. But the other is sort of strategic, right? If you're thinking about it in a reparations frame, the city of Evanston is not going to come up with a lot of money. The city of St. Louis is going to come up with nothing. No. But the federal government has deeper pockets, right? And so I think there's a sort of strategic imperative to emphasize federal complicity in this. And so if you think about it, what is it that creates unequal opportunities and unequal outcomes? And so in the first blush, I would say, the opportunities are restricted by social norms and by violence. That's the first reaction. One can think of racial zoning, which has a brief life, sort of 1910 to 1917, and restrictive covenants as responses to a collective action problem, right? We can't just do this one smoke bomb at a time. We got to be more systematic about this. So there's that response. Then, as I suggested, you create this pattern of segregation. Segregation in turn levies, what economists call a segregation tax, in the sense that houses are more expensive than they should be, and they don't appreciate in value the way houses in other parts of the city do. And so in terms of the loss of equity, there's the outright exclusion, right? You cannot live in this neighborhood and we will not write you a loan. And so there's complicity there, but there's also exploitation, in the sense that, oh, you can have a house, but it's in this part of town where your house is going to be worth less 10 years from now than it is now. And it's almost impossible to untangle which of those are responsible for, because it's different in every setting, right? I mean, that has a different trajectory in St. Louis, which has been a struggling city since the 1970s, than it does in a city that, like Chicago or Pittsburgh, that you sort of reinvents itself economically and redevelops in a different pattern. All of which is to say, I think this is why reparations economists like William Darity and others basically say, we know all of these things contribute. All we can really do is work with the end sum. So we'll use the racial wealth gap as a proxy for all of the wages that were stolen in slavery, and in occupational segregation, all of the lost housing opportunities. We do have a total at the end of the day, and that's the one we'll work with.
When you're talking about institutionalization, I understand the regulatory framework, right? Tell me a little more about sort of restrictive covenants, what enforcement looked like. And I'm just trying to imagine, like, if we're relying on enforcement through private cause of action, like the cost of litigation and the interest in the courts in entertaining, how did that look, and like what that trend did that trend follow the trend of removal, or did it lead it or lag it?
That's a really good question.
Posed, but
yeah. So one interesting thing about Shelley is it shouldn't have made that big a difference, because there was not a lot of state enforcement of these. They were much more powerfully social norms, particularly the subdivision-based one. In fact, I found, and so if you look at the state level litigation prior to Shelley, there's the case, so cases that make it to the appellate level, to the statewide level. There's only about 70 nationwide, and about half of those are in California and Michigan and Missouri. So they're not widely litigated, and the ones that are litigated are all the petitions, and all the litigation is about, you drew up a shitty contract, and so we're going to tear it up. But the courts sort of went both ways on this. In one respect, somebody would come in and say, like a white homeowner challenging a restriction because they wanted to get out from under it and sell, would say, you have to void this restriction because look, there's African Americans living there and African Americans living there. And the courts would sometimes say, well, that's why you signed the restriction, right? Because you were being encroached upon. So you can't now use the encroachment to say it doesn't have any value. So the courts were like unreliable, except on that sort of narrow contractual sort of contract law front. You do find, and so almost all of the enforcement is in those petition restrictions that are in transitional neighborhoods, and it's done by injunction. And so the St. Louis Real Estate Exchange will call the police, and the police will come, the sheriff will come in and tell someone they have to leave because there's a restricted covenant, and like a foreclosure, put their, belongings on the curb. But the enforcement was also, as before the existence of the restriction, often informal. So in St. Louis, for example, when the civil rights attorney Scoville Richardson bought a house in a restricted neighborhood pointedly so he could challenge the restriction. The enforcement was his house got bombed. And that was and it got bombed repeatedly. So and when Shelley is decided in 1948, the realtors just go, what's the big deal? It's not going to change what we do. And they don't think it's going to make that a big a difference. And it ends up only making a difference in those settings like North St. Louis, where the neighborhood is on the verge of tipping anyway. And, people are in these little small scale petition covenants that they feel are just about to fail. Does that answer your question?
We've got a question from someone online. Reg Jackson asks, can you elaborate on the destruction of the FHA maps, please?
I don't know that much about it, except that, during the run up to the Civil Rights Act, there was, understandably a lot of anxiety about federal complicity in this. And so at the federal level in Washington, the FHA actually destroyed the equivalent maps. We know they existed because they're referred to elsewhere, and a few have cropped up in other settings. There's one for Chicago that a Chicago planner had in his papers, that sort of thing. So I don't know, and I don't think anyone really knows, there's not a memo saying, burn them. But that's clearly what happened. And it does create this sort of interesting sort of archival gap where people, without admitting it, are using the Hulk maps as a proxy because they figured they did about the same thing. And we do have some narrative descriptions of FHA mapping, and that suggests they did roughly the same thing. But by the time the FHA is really ramping up its business, it's mostly about building new houses in the suburbs. The FHA never does much refinancing. And so they're not about to put much money into central cities anyway. It is an interesting, it's like a fun, it's moving.
I've always heard that it was I read it and tried to follow up. This was actually one of my questions because you mentioned it. Is there's a response to 2 court cases, from what I understand, against the FHA. So they were sort of facing potential litigation and decided to destroy the maps.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
The evidence, I think, is that. But I was going to ask if you knew the cases. I don't know.
These are cases where FHA was a party to the case, or I'm not sure.
Do you think there was some incentive behind these restrictions to gerrymander, or was it solely just fear of amalgamation?
Gerrymander in what way? You mean like in terms of
Politics.
where to draw? Oh,
Yeah, where to draw the.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a complicated question because, if you think back to the map of St. Louis, I won't bother bringing it up again, but you have the city of St. Louis, which is that crescent on the Mississippi, and then St. Louis County. St. Louis County has 101 municipalities. It's one of the most fragmented counties. And almost all of those municipalities were invented to sustain segregation. Because what happened in St. Louis is a developer would go out into a cornfield and say, I'm going to build a subdivision. I'm going to call it Common Country Estates or Happy Acres or something. And I'm going to, it's going to be strictly restricted, that sort of thing. And then after 1948, after the Shelley decision, there's a flurry of municipalization. You take these unincorporated pockets of housing and you say, well, we got to draw a line around it, call it a municipality so we can zone. Because if you're in unincorporated land in the county, you didn't have the power to zone. And what you can see, particularly in that early round of municipalization in the 1940s, is the subdivision of Happy Acres becomes the municipality of Happy Acres on exactly the same footprint, which is why there's so many of them. And they say, in defiance of all good planning and, in fact, of state law at the time, we'll just make it all large lot single family zoning. Despite the fact that even in municipalities that weren't large lot single family zoning. So they would, because you can do this sort of upzoning strategy to and say that every property that's in this municipality is non-conforming because they're duplexes and they're too small, but you control all future development in that way. So you see a lot of that. So that's where the gerrymandering comes in, when municipal zoning is used to sustain these agreements. And you see that, and it's an interesting case because normally it's very hard to find stuff about those kinds of decisions at the local level. But the largest urban planning firm in the country, Harlan Bartholomew and Associates, was a St. Louis-based firm. And it wrote the plans for all these little municipalities. And its archives are at WashU in St. Louis. And so there's all this correspondence between city officials saying, you know, how do we keep the Negroes on this side of the tracks? And Bartholomew, who was a sort of soulless municipal engineer, just like, you know, it's a problem I've been asked to solve, would just say, well, this is what worked in Richmond Heights. You know, we zoned it for X. And if you zoom in on the maps in South St. Louis and in the county, you'll find that the large lot single family zoning areas, both across municipalities, but also within them, have exactly the same footprints as the original covenants.
I'm getting more of an idea about this listening to you talk and reading some of your book. But I'm curious if you have any more detail about some of these post-Shelley developments that included racial restrictive covenants. So there's like a couple in Wisconsin that were built in 1952, and they had racially restrictive covenants. Is that just sort of like a big, we're going to do it anyway, we just want it there, even though it's not enforceable, or is there?
Yeah. So it's a bit of both. So I find them scattered through the records afterwards, and I think there's a couple of things going on. One is because it's such a prominent business practice in the 1930s or 1940s, that some developers just, they don't blink at Shelley and they just keep doing it. Because to them, it's a social norm. It's not about enforcement. And they can send that signal. I particularly see it in suburban settings where a developer is doing one of these large scale developments where it's like Happy Acres Phase 1, Happy Acres Phase 2, and when you get to Happy Acres Phase 5 in 1958, they're still using the same language they used in 1948. So there's this inertia. So that's one. The second one is some developers knew exactly what they were doing. And even if they got into the business in 1954, they were like, I can do this. I can't ask the judge to enforce it, but I can still do it and send that norm. And it becomes, like a homeowner's sort of thing. You're just setting the social norms. Your house has to be this color, the rocks in your driveway can't be this tall, all these sort of meticulous agreements. And then the third piece, which I think is important, is that Shelley is not decisive on the question of enforcement, because in the immediate wake of Shelley, what the big developers and realtors do is they say, how else can we enforce these? And one is to have another enforcement mechanism, like belonging to a country club. And so country club based developments could have restrictions on membership in the country club that we couldn't have on the housing, but it spilled over into the housing. And so that became common. The other one that lasted for about 5 years after Shelley was damage suits. So in a number of settings, they reworded the covenants to say that if your neighbor breaks the covenant, you can sue them for the loss of value in your property. Because the argument was that we're not penalizing the African Americans who can't buy the property anymore. It's not an equal protection issue. I'm suing my neighbor for damages. And the Supreme Court threw that out in 1953 in a case called Barrows versus Jackson.
What role, if any, did the home owner, like a home insurance, like insurers, play in this story, and when? To what degree are they complicit?
So it comes later, and their complicity, I think, is more with more at that cusp where the FHA gets involved, because home ownership in the way we think of it today is not before you're actually insuring the mortgage, there's not much to insure, right? And so the insuring a home in the 1920s because you're afraid someone will slip on the ice in your sidewalk is not that common. Homeownership becomes ubiquitous when the banks require you to have it. And that doesn't really happen until you have these low ratio mortgages that the FHA makes possible that then have to be insured. And so they come later to the game, I think. And they, they pick up on the assumptions and the language and the assumptions, particularly about housing value and both races and spaces that come out of this history. But it would be more a case of sort of forward emulation than involved at the time.
Being an avid, I want to talk about St. Louis a little, and being an avid hockey fan, if I may brag, I've been to stadiums all over the country: Tampa Bay Lightning, Los Angeles Kings, Columbus Jackets, Blue Jackets, Nashville Predators, Chicago Blackhawks, Minneapolis Wild, and St. Louis Blues. What makes St. Louis unique and different than all the other stadiums is that all the other stadiums had at most 1% blacks, most likely 0.1%. St. Louis Blues, and I've been to many Blues games, about a third of the fans are black. How do you explain that?
St. Louis is a majority black city. It's much different. It's like Philadelphia. And
Well, given its history of what you said,
I mean, part of it is, because St. Louis is a border city with an early African-American population, it sustains more so than Detroit or Milwaukee or these sort of second great migration cities. It sustains an African-American middle class, as a majority African-American city to the present day. And so, you see that in patterns of housing in St. Louis. It's while the index of dissimilarity is very high in St. Louis, the index of the sort of concentration index is not, because African Americans live all over the region. In fact, more African Americans live now in St. Louis County than in the city. And so the housing options were there for African Americans. And that's one reason why the petition covenants were so fierce on the north side, because there was a well-established middle-class African-American community that was in a position to buy houses. And, these were law professors and dentists and surgeons that were looking to buy houses. Whereas, in other settings, just the income and the wage gap did the work of segregation, because African-Americans were overwhelmingly renters in second-grade migration cities like Milwaukee. I'm a captain of my hockey team, by the way. We're not very good.
Did the place so it seems like the kind of story of these covenants sort of stop it near the 40s, 50s at sort of wide flight deindustrialization to cities like St. Louis, Upper Baltimore, so similar story happens. Do those places that used to have the covenants become sort of these like vessels for that pattern of wide flight from the core parts of the cities?
I mean, in terms of what a covenant neighborhoods look like today?
Yeah, exactly. Like that's where they moved to.
So it depends much more on the kind of covenant and on the lot size.
Okay.
So, in this inner suburbs of St. Louis, for example, and in the city of St. Louis, petition covenants had no lasting value. They could not, and partly because they were fragile. They were the ones that were legally vulnerable, and partly because in St. Louis and elsewhere, the signatories to a petition covenants were, they were reluctant collective actors, and they would at a moment's notice because they felt their neighborhood was about to tip. So as I said earlier, these are the white homeowners who are trying to get out from under, who want to get out from under these agreements. And so the moment that they're deemed unenforceable, it's like, come on. So in fact, you see I have a version of a thing I did for a different presentation in St. Louis, where I have a Google Street View of every restricted house in a particular part of the city. And the vast majority of them are vacant lots. Because the collapse of housing value is just dramatic. The other piece of that is in the immediate inner suburbs, which are a target of black flight in the 1960s and 1970s, the lot sizes are very small. And so they are white working class, first generation white flight, that have, fiercely covenanted neighborhoods. They have clan meetings, the whole works. But then they leave and leapfrog further out. And cities like Ferguson go into this sort of steep transition where they go from 95% to now 75% black pretty quickly. But it's all about the lot size. And so, it only really lasts where there was no African American threat to begin with, and the lot sizes are large. And in that case, I would say the covenant is really not doing the work as much as the racial wealth gap. There has been some work by economists using the Minneapolis data, suggesting that covenanted properties led to increase in housing values. I'm a little bit dubious about, this. It's a complicated causal chain.
Cognizant about time here. I hope you don't mind. So my work is in gentrification. I went on to extrapolate a little bit beyond your work, not as far as hockey, but just geographically, it seems like your cases don't lend themselves very easily to sort of a gentrification analysis. Some of these places are smaller. I don't know gentrification in St. Louis that much. The Minneapolis case, a lot of the restrictions that you present are outside in the suburban area, so not in the inner city where there is a lot of gentrification happening. So if you could go outside of this and think about maybe, West Coast, East Coast, and some of these other prominent gentrification geographies, what do you think the effect or the impact of these racial restrictions or the relationship with them and sort of a geography of gentrification? Because I could see sort of, if I were imagining sort of your St. Louis 2020 map in my head, sort of very split along that divide. If this were a gentrifying geography, maybe some of the areas around the border would have significantly changed in their demographic characteristics in the contemporary. I could see some of these places in their centrality, not following some of this characterization of durable segregation. What do you make of that, or how would you extend that out to this issue of gentrification?
Yeah, it's a good question. First of all, people study St. Louis argue about this all the time. I sort of fall on the side of there is no gentrification in St. Louis, really. There's a couple of group homes on the south side, but and some of the older housing on the south side is now higher value, but I don't characterize that as gentrification. It hadn't involved any sort of demographic transformation, any sort of redevelopment. It's just that you have that stark divide, and you have in St. Louis exactly the housing stock south of Del Mar as you do north. It's just that this stuff is worth 5 times as much. But I wouldn't call it gentrification. It's more the destruction that's going on above the line. And by the same token, in a setting like Minneapolis, where you do have some gentrification, it's occurring more in the fringes of downtown, not in areas that were covenanted, in areas that were restricted. So it's hard to draw a direct line. The other interesting thing is, a lot of times gentrification involves redevelopment. So, and this is another instance in which you can't just sort of jump from the covenants housing values today, because some covenanted neighborhoods were severely sort of stressed. And that's why they were covenanted. And so they became something else because all the houses were knocked down and they built something else like higher end housing. And in which case, the original covenant has a very sort of complicated relationship with what's there now, because it could have been a pretext for blighting and redevelopment and gentrification, or it could just stay as it was in 1930 and still be, not very good neighborhood. I don't, the other thing is, in other settings that I've studied. So in Philadelphia, for example, so in St. Louis, I found Greater St. Louis about 120,000 parcels that were restricted. A colleague of mine at the Federal Reserve in Philadelphia is doing similar work, scraping Philadelphia deeds. He found 3,000 because something else is doing the work of segregation. It was very rare to have race restrictive covenants in New York City. There's a few of them in Queens. There's a few on the borders of Harlem, but most of that work is done by co-op boards and landlords. And so, it's a mechanism that is particular to, in the way I've described today, to the urbanizing, industrializing Midwest. And it has a particularly different pattern on the West Coast, where the targets are mostly Asian and where they begin earlier in response as a form of Chinese exclusion, but often take different forms. There's as much effort to exclude Asian businesses as there are occupancy. And so these are redrawn to fit local circumstances in ways that make it very hard to sort of generalize them across those local circumstances. In Philadelphia, again, they're used in the sort of railroad suburbs that go out from the city, but mostly on the fill-in suburbs that are auto suburbs. So not at the railroad stops, but on the ones in between. And they're very dependent upon time. If you have an area where most of the housing is built in the 1920s, it's mostly restricted. But if you're in an older urbanized area like Philadelphia or New York, or one, as like in the Southwest, where most of the housing is built much later, you won't find this.
I'm curious whether you've looked at DC, just as someone who's lived there previously and who lived in like Black neighborhoods in DC, not in white neighborhoods, and like kind of witnessed that gentrification line moving west.
It's a good question. So DC is similar to St. Louis and Baltimore, and it's a border city. It has a large African-American population. But going back to the earlier question, it has, this well-established middle and upper class African-American population, including, the shock troops of the NAACP and the lawyers at Howard University. And there's a very active campaign of residential restriction. And there's a group in DC, used to be called Prologue DC, and is now something else, that is doing this work. They're documenting it. I think if you Google mapping segregation DC, you'll find their website. I want to give a shout out to the National Research Coalition that collects all the people working on different settings. But the DC is a super interesting case because, the white realtors and developers are actively restricting the neighborhoods where the lawyers who are doing this national work are living. Right? Charles Houston and for a time, Lauren Miller and others. And so they're very plugged into this. And when the Shelley case makes its way to the Supreme Court, it's actually 3 cases, one from DC, one from Detroit, and one from St. Louis. The DC case is different because equal protection doesn't apply because DC is not a state, right? So it's decided on different grounds. But I think that's May versus Burgess is the DC case. But there's a really fascinating NAACP conference on restrictive covenants in 1945 that Thurgood Marshall pulls together in Chicago, where the point of the conference is basically saying, we're so sick of winning these cases on technical grounds, right? Because, A, we're not making any headway, but B, the implication is that if everyone signs on the right line, there's nothing wrong with it. We really need an equal protection case, or a 13th or a 14th Amendment case. And so they have the Gee case coming out of Michigan, the Shelley case coming out of St. Louis, and the Mays case coming out of DC. And they work on those in concert and get them to Shelley. So DC is a big player in this, partly because, that confrontation is so stark between, the cream of Howard Law School and NAACP and the restrictions.
I could ask a question. Okay.
Yes. This will be our final question. Thank you very much.
Here in Madison, there was an effort this past year by in a neighborhood called the Highlands to use restrictive covenants to resist a local planning effort to upzone and allow smaller lot sizes in their neighborhood. And I wonder if you can just talk about kind of whether you see that as a legacy of some of these restrictions. I think as I followed it, it seemed like there were some echoes of some of these practices from the 20th century, but I just want to get your sense of how that goes.
Yeah, so I mean, the relationship between private restrictions, which still exist, and zoning is complicated because certainly they're seen as complementary. One of the driving forces behind private restriction is the Buchanan case in 1917, which says you can't race zone, and so early efforts at that they switch over to these private contracts instead. But as in a lot of areas of the law, technically a private restriction can't undo the public law. It can be more restrictive. It can't be less restrictive, which is the logic of zoning anyway. It can always be more restrictive. And certainly large lot zoning and restricted zoning is, as I suggested in response to the earlier question, one of the responses, like this is what we'll do instead kind of response. In Minneapolis, the work by Just Deeds and the Mapping Prejudice project whose data I use in my project, led to a decision by the city of Minneapolis to do no further single family zoning. It's sort of symbolic because they're not developing new land anyway. But that connection is very important. And the example that you mentioned reminds me of one that I ran into in St. Louis, where when I was doing the work locally, and I was doing it in concert with a local equal housing group, and we were doing it with homeowners associations who wanted to, we didn't know it was in there, we'll take it out kind of thing. And we did this with one homeowners association in University Heights near Washington University, in a very, University City, in a very high-end neighborhood. It's like $1 million houses. And they fiercely wanted to get rid of their race restriction. And we helped them do that and do the legal work and file the paperwork, only to find out at the same time that they were in this fierce battle to sustain large lot single families in their neighborhood. So they wanted to do the symbolic racial equity work on a thing that wasn't enforceable anywhere. But in terms of like actually sustaining that advantage, they were willfully oblivious to the connection.